You can have this feeling anytime you choose.
Hey guys, welcome to Startup Faith. This is one of our bonus episodes. So hopefully you've been following along with us with this series that we're doing through this app called First Steps. But yeah, there was just a couple of topics that we thought were really important to talk about.
Yep.
So why don't you tell us what we're talking about today?
Well, we're going to talk today about the Great Commission. Both Nick and I serve with Power to Change, which is part of Crew Global, and we're an organisation that was founded with a vision to help fulfil the Great Commission. And so if you don't know the Great Commission, they're the verses right at the end of Matthew's Gospel, in Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 to 20. And so Nick, would you mind reading them for us?
Yeah,
Matthew 28. Our founder, Bill Bright, called the Great Commission the greatest challenge ever given by the greatest person who ever lived, accompanied by the greatest promise ever made. And so let's see if we can see those themes coming through as you're reading these verses for us.
So from verse 18.
Verse 18.
And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age."
Great. So when we look at those verses, verse 18
Yep.
is what Bill Bright calls the greatest person who ever lived, Jesus having all authority in heaven and earth. The final verse, "Surely I am with you always to the very end of the age," is the greatest promise.
Greatest promise, right? Yeah.
But what is the greatest challenge that Jesus gave us, left us with here, according to verse 19?
Yeah, go and make disciples.
Yeah, so it's interesting because people always think that the command is to make disciples, but when you go back to the original Greek,
Right.
the command, the imperative term is to make disciples. The word "go" is not actually an imperative.
Yeah, wow, okay.
So the command is
What
to
do
make.
you mean by the imperative?
An imperative
Just unpack
is another word for command.
that. Okay, sure.
Yep. So the Greek grammar, I had to learn English grammar before I learned Greek grammar. The command is to make disciples of all nations. That's the greatest challenge.
So that's the emphasis is on the disciples rather than the go.
That's
part,
right.
is it? Yeah.
Well, the make disciples is the main goal, the main
Okay,
purpose, the main thing that we've been challenged to do. Sure. And it leaves us with a great question: how do we make disciples of all nations?
Yep.
Right?
Yeah. What is a disciple? How do you make him? Yeah.
That's right. And the good news for us is that when Jesus gives the Great Commission, he not only gives us the challenge, but he tells us how to go about making disciples. And he does that by using three what we call participles. They're words that in the Great Commission are used to describe how to carry out the command. And in English, you can often recognize a participle because it finishes with the letters ing. And so the first ing word in the Great Commission, Nick, what do you see there?
Baptizing.
Baptizing. So baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.
Yep.
Why is that the first step in making disciples, do you think?
I'm guessing for the sake of, a baptism is
Well, when do people get baptized?
when they become a Christian.
Well, as a good Baptist, yeah, that's right. Okay, so people who are
depends on your denomination.
That's right. I think even if you don't hold to believers' baptism, if you hold a different view, you can still say that baptism marks the point where somebody enters into the people of God.
Yeah, sure.
And identifies as a follower of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and they're identifying with his people. That's right. I don't think baptism personally is something that's just like my own private deal.
Right, yeah.
Right, this is
it's like
that,
it's a communal thing. It's a public thing in the presence of a community of people.
That's right. And so the question is, if that's when somebody, and we're thinking particularly with university students, if we're going to make disciples with university students, they're young adults, they're at a point where it's not somebody else making a decision for them, it's about them making a decision.
Right.
So the question is, what do we do to help people get to the point where they're ready to make a decision to follow Jesus? What's the Christian jargon term that we use?
Evangelism.
Evangelism, exactly right. So So we want to help people understand who Jesus is
Right.
and what his message is. And we want to get them to the point where they can make a decision whether or not they want to follow Jesus.
Okay.
So I often think that the first step in making disciples, the best way to say it is that we're asking people, are you ready to follow Jesus yet?
Right. Okay.
Right? Now that might be a decision that takes them a long time to make, right? They may come from a background where they know nothing about Jesus and they need to learn a lot of things. Or they may have grown up in a church, heard lots of stuff, but never just come to that point of decision, and they may be able to make a decision on the spot. So I think...
but if you haven't actually asked that question and answered it affirmatively, you can't say that you're a Christian, right?
That's right. That's the point where you go, yep, I'm definitely following Jesus. And becoming a Christian is the first step in making disciples.
Right.
Right? So often we get caught up in the idea that that people aren't ready to hear the gospel right now. You know, they're not ready to make a decision to follow Jesus right now. I think anytime we make that decision for somebody else, we're actually short-circuiting what God wants to do.
Yeah.
If we don't ask people that question, we're not obeying his command to make disciples. So the first ing word is the baptizing. What's the second ing word that we see there in verse 20?
Verse 20 is teaching.
Yeah,
Teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you.
Yeah. See, we often think of teaching as passing information.
Right.
But how does Jesus describe it there? In the NIV it says teaching them to obey.
To obey, yeah, right.
Teaching them to observe in the ESV, teaching them to obey. And we know that when Matthew's gospel has 5 great big teaching blocks. There's 5 sermons. Starts off with the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5 to 7. And that passage, that sermon has lots of really practical teaching. So it starts off with the Beatitudes, but it talks about how to, being salt and light, and about divorce and murder and giving oaths and praying and really practical things, right?
Yeah.
And it finishes with a little parable. Jesus gets to the end of his sermon, he finishes with a parable. And do you remember what the parable is? I would hope so.
Is it the one where it's like someone who builds their house on this
rock and the man who builds his house on the
sand?
Right, so one's the wise builder,
one's
the foolish builder.
Yeah.
What's the same thing that happened? Like he says, how does he compare and contrast?
The storm comes and one stands still, and Yeah.
So what's the compare and contrast? So both of them, when it comes to being examples of followers of Jesus, both of them hear Jesus teaching,
right?
But only one of them puts it into practice.
Yeah.
Okay, so even back in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is concerned not just with teaching them, because they both heard, but only he wants to teach them to obey. And it's not just teach them to obey or observe a few things. He wants to teach them to observe or obey everything.
Right. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who's built his house on the rock.
That's right.
And then verse 26, everyone who hears these words and does not do them will be like a foolish man who's built his house on the sand.
That's right. So the first step in making disciples, sometimes people think, I make disciples by doing evangelism.
Right.
And it's like, well, that's the first step. But someone who prays to receive Christ, who becomes a believer, starts to follow Jesus, our next step is that we want to teach them, yes, good information, but also teach them how to live out that faith, as we've been doing through these first steps studies.
Yeah.
Right? But the goal of, so often we stop there, right? But in the Great Commission itself, Jesus gives us a third participle, and except it's not marked by the letters ing.
I was going to say.
Yeah, that's right.
Holding?
We won't go there, won't get distracted with that. But back in the beginning of verse 19 is actually the third participle, and it's translated in our English translations as go.
Yeah, right. Okay.
So it is, the word go is a participle. It's baptize, teach to obey, and go.
Right.
Now, it's a participle, so you could translate it, and some people like to argue, you can translate this as you are going.
Right,
Make
yeah.
disciples,
Yeah, I've heard people talk about that before.
That's right. But it's a little bit more intense than that. Because if you go back to your Greek grammars, and I actually read this up and memorized this phrase because it was just so critical for me. They said because of its priority, that is the beginning of the sentence, and its proximity to the main command,
right,
it actually has the force of a command.
Yeah. Okay,
so even though it's a participle, It's actually acting like a command.
Right.
So it's not a command, but it's acting like a command. And so what that means is that the third step in making disciples is for people to be going to make disciples. Now, sometimes we think, oh, that means going somewhere else, going overseas, going to a different location. But I think because it's a participle, it doesn't mean, pick up your stuff and go somewhere else and then baptize and teach. He's like, as you are going, be intentional, be strategic, take the initiative. Don't just sit back and wait for people to come to you to share the gospel with them. Don't just sit back and wait for people to come to you to teach them, but you take the initiative wherever you are, whatever you're doing, make disciples. Take the initiative to make disciples. And our goal is to become disciples who know how to make disciples.
Yeah, sure.
And so in Power to Change, in Crew Global, we call this Connect, or Connect, Build, Send, or Win, Build, Send. And those three words are simply baptizing, teaching to obey, and going.
Right, yeah.
And that's the process that of the great challenge that Jesus has left with us.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, well, thanks, Geoff. That's really helpful, kind of unpacking that. And I've heard you talk about that before, and I feel like this passage of the Great Commission, it's not always one that we're super familiar, although I think that's changing in the church context. But the importance of the Great Commission as the kind of mission for the church, I think, is really significant and something that we need to be aware of and understand. So yeah, that's great.
Thanks, Nick.
All right, well, thank you, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.